Hey guys, how's it going? Kripp here. It is time for another Whispers of the Old Gods card review. This week we had some pretty good cards and a few blunders here. I think this first one here, Forlorn Stalker, is closer to the blunder category. It's a 3-mana 4/2, and the battle card gives all the Deathrattle minions in your hand +1/+1. Now, Hunter admittedly has a lot of good Deathrattle minions, but at the same time a lot of them are moving out when Standard comes in. So will this card be good in the non-standard format? Just probably not. It just doesn't seem completely broken, even though you have more synergy there. It just doesn't seem that it's quite on the same power level. Now, the issue I have with this card is typically in the Hunter decks that run a lot of Deathrattle minions, they want to play these minions out quickly. They're usually 1, 2, and maybe 3 mana Deathrattle minions. So even though your whole deck might be Deathrattle minions, because of the nature of the Hunter class and how you'll have to play them, you're realistically not going to be holding that many when you're playing this guy, because Hunters just empty out their hands faster than most other classes. So how many do you need to have in your hand for this guy to be pretty decent? So if you have none in your hand, it's obviously garbage. If you have 1 in your hand, it's 3 mana for kind of like a delayed 5/3. Is that really good? No, it's actually probably not good enough. I think you'd have to have 2 Deathrattle minions in your hand for this guy to be kind of worth it. And even then, I would argue it's still not all that great, as buffed up Deathrattle minions that come out in the future are, again, even more prone to silence, as they generally are to begin with the Deathrattle tag. So I don't think it's that great. I think it's a very poor card. It might see some play in some very niche decks, but even then, I really doubt it. And we had a lot of mage cards, starting with a Faceless Summoner released this week. A 6 mana 5/5 Battle Cry summon a 3-cost minion. Now there are some very powerful 3-cost minions. Probably the best one is Injured Blademaster, because when you're summoning a card, the Battle Cries are not triggered. So Injured Blademaster is a 3 mana 4/7. So you could play Faceless Summoner and end up with, 9/12 worth of stats for 6. Which is pretty nuts. The card overall is a very powerful one. It seems like it'll probably make some constructed lists, because in constructed, to have multiple bodies over one card is very valuable. In Arena, this can be good, but it might not necessarily be good. The reason I mention is, yes, it's a common Arena card. It's obviously a very good card for Arena, so Mage will kind of, creep even further, but I kind of want to play it down a notch to maybe give you guys some understanding about how Arena works. So this card is obviously very good in Arena. I think it is better than, the standard for 6 drops, which is Boulder Fist Ogre. I think it's better than that, but I don't think it's much better than that. The reason I say that is, in Arena, you can't really afford to have that many high cost minions, and anything over 5 is high cost because you can only play 1 of it a turn if you happen to draw 2 of them. So you can't have that many cards over 6 in Arena, so they better be really good. And is this really good? It's really good, but you still can't draft like a crazy number of them. It's not really too broken, because in that stage of late game cards, just in general, it's 6 and 7, maybe even 8 is roughly the same thing when it comes to Arena, because you can only have maybe 3 of these in your deck. So it's not that it's competing for the 6 slot, it's competing for the late game in Arena. And if your opponent has, the Boulder Fist Ogre that we've been talking about, this guy will just kind of trade for Boulder Fist Ogre most of the time. While Faceless Summoner will crush a lot of the minions played before him, when it comes to trading for the late game, it's not really out of control. Does this make Mage better in Arena? Yeah, it kind of does, because Mage doesn't really have those big minions, but I don't think it'll improve Mage in Arena by a considerable amount. I still think we'll have kind of like a top 2 or 3 best classes, even though it seems like Mage is getting the better half of the common cards for Arena purposes from what we've seen so far in Whispers of the Old Gods. And we have Twilight Flamecaller, another mage common, 3 mana 2/2. The battle cry deals 1 damage to all enemy minions. This guy seems very powerful if a lot of people are playing, just kind of like the dinky minions, a lot of 1 health minions, like the aggro style stuff. It feels like one of those measures that will just counter it. So if people are playing the 1 health mass aggro deck, this guy's going to be there to keep them in check. I don't think he's good enough to just see play in whatever mage deck you want, but, if the game starts leading into that direction where a lot of people are playing these aggressive cards, well, yeah, this guy was going to come back and he's going to be pretty good. Now, a lot of cases in Arena, the game is already that. A card like Arcane Explosion, which might seem really bad, is really quite fine in Arena, even though in that environment you're not even too likely to end up picking a spell damage minion. Just 2 mana deal 1 everything from your opponent's side of the board is pretty decent, which actually means that this card is very good and it has the potential to be completely insane. There have been a warrior card recently released from Whispers of the Old Gods that does kind of the same thing. It does 1 to all, but it's 3 for a 3/3 body. I think that is better. The main issue is with a 3-drop 2/2 worth of stats is quite poor if you have to play out of necessity for tempo reasons. So this card I don't think is too broken just because of that, but it is a very solid card nonetheless, at least for Arena. For Constructed, it's kind of like that preventative measure like I mentioned. And we have Demented Frostcaller, 4 mana, 2/4, so really bad stats, and after you cast a spell, freeze a random enemy character. And we received some confirmation from Blizzard. Some of the details in this card prevents it from freezing an already frozen character, so if you're casting a ton of spells, you are actually going to freeze their entire board. I see this card being useful in the situations where, you have like maybe one big minion you don't really want to deal with and you have a lot of granular spells. If you play 2 spells, you basically guarantee to freeze your opponent's face and the big minion if it's the only one on the board. So there are some situations where this can get pretty out of control. I imagine it's going to be one of those cards that's going to be extremely powerful in some of the adventures that we're going to, like the PvE stuff that we're going to have in the future. But it seems like the stats are just a little bit too poor to see regular play, even though it does seem like it could be a card that could get really out of control. It just seems like it costs way too much. You have to compare it to like Flamewaker, right? So Flamewaker is a very powerful card, but even at 3 mana, you often have problems playing it and dishing out enough spells for it to actually matter. And when it comes to freezing one thing versus pinging something randomly twice, I think I'd rather have Flamewaker in almost every case. So we'll see. Seems like kind of a bad card, but it might get out of control in a very specific deck. Now, the next card is also a mage card here, is Servant of Yoggsaron. This is a card that Trump got to release that was given to Blizzard, and, he kind of looked at it in a fairly optimistic light. And the way he kind of analyzed it is that in like 60 to 70% of the time, you have a positive or neutral effect from the battle cry. Cast a random spell that costs 5 or less, targets chosen randomly. So I made a video about Yoggsaron in a lot of detail and how this kind of would work, and you guys have seen it's not necessarily all that great when it comes to Yoggsaron, but because you get so many, the effect is kind of interesting and cool and maybe has a very positive effect in some games. With Servant of Yoggsaron, you only get 1 spell. It's restricted to 5 or less mana, and yes, you can draw like 3 cards of Nourish, but you could also Soulfire itself, basically paying 5 mana and removing 2 cards from your hand. And that's it. So the effect can be very wild, and more importantly, it's much earlier in the game. In typical board state, if you get a buff, you might play it on your opponent's minion. He'll probably have a minion going into turn 5, so it might not work too well. It'll probably work okay in terms of buffs if you have a lot of minions, but if you have a lot of minions, there's a good chance that one of them is going to die to a spell. So I see so many conflicting situations here that I kind of think the card hasn't really been analyzed in the correct light. So you have to look at it this way, when you play Yoggsaron, the game is so developed and you're playing so many spells that, the good ones will generally outweigh the bad ones. With this guy, you only get 1 spell. And okay, it's going to be positive or neutral, let's say 75% of the time. And I think that's generous, right? But what about that last 25%? What if it's even 20%? What if it's even 15%? In those bad percentage points, you will lose the game. So the question that I really want to pose to people is, do you really want to play a card for 5 mana that will, let's say 1 in 5, 1 in 6 times when you play it, straight up just cost you the game? And the answer is no. Some people compare the card to like Matter Bomber, and Matter Bomber is a really good card. It's kind of like a fringe card in some situations. It's very powerful, in others it's pretty bad. But it's so rare that a Matter Bomber's bad effects would cause you to lose the game. So if you have like 3 minions and you play Matter Bomber and Matter Bomber kills one of them, it's probably like a 2 health minion, maybe a 3 health minion. That's really bad, but you're not going to lose the game off of that. The Ceremony of Yoggsaron, its bad category, is a disaster. And that is why I think the card will not really see any play. People might just play it because it's, again, one of those very fun cards, but I really doubt that it will be very effective overall, even though it can be very strong at times, like drawing 2 cards or something like that. I don't think that will necessarily win you the game. It'll just be a good card, but when it's bad, you will definitely lose the game because of such colossal tempo issues. Then we had a Priest card, Shifting Shade, 4 mana, 4/3, and Deathrattle puts a copy of your opponent's, puts a card from your opponent's deck and add it to your hand. So you kind of get a nice Thoughtsteal effect there. I compared this card to Thoughtsteal, but it's kind of a little bit of a vague comparison. The card might look bad because of the bad stats, but the effect is kind of draw a card, and 4 mana for 4/3 to draw a card of the Deathrattle is, I think, okay. People play Thoughtsteal, right? People play Thoughtsteal a lot of time because it's a spell and has some interaction with spell synergistic cards and Priest, but they also just play Thoughtsteal because they like getting additional value outside of their deck. That aspect is very powerful when in Hearthstone, specifically for the Priest class, which can out-fatigue most other decks. When you compare Shifting Shade to Thoughtsteal, you can compare it this way. So the Deathrattle effect from Shifting Shade is half of Thoughtsteal. The other half of Thoughtsteal is basically like the 3 mana you get another card, right? With Shifting Shade, you get 4 mana for a 4/3. So a 4/3 is just a card in itself, right? But if you're playing a card in itself 4/3, right, and you're getting that extra card from Thoughtsteal, the difference between the two is it's as if you played Thoughtsteal and you got a 1 mana 4/3 with no abilities. Now, if you played Thoughtsteal, got a random card from your opponent's deck, and in addition to that, got a 1 mana 4/3 minion, I think that would generally be a little bit stronger than the typical result from Thoughtsteal. Generally. Not always. You can always Thoughtsteal a lot of very powerful legendary minions. So, is this card good? I think it's good. I think it's slightly better than Thoughtsteal in a lot of situations where you're trying to gain that effect, and it's also a very good card because it's flexible. You can play it on turn 4, and you can start contesting the board. Thoughtsteal doesn't do that at all. Thoughtsteal, if you're playing it on turn 3 or turn 4, you have to, get pretty lucky to get something from your opponent's deck to play with it. And if you do, it's not going to be a 4/3 minion for that last mana crystal. So I think it's quite good, it's quite a balanced card, and I think it'll make some Priest lists. Then we have Embrace the Shadow, 2 mana spell, and this turn your healing effects deal damage instead. So it's kind of like the Auchenai Soul Priest effect for less mana, making it so you can maybe combo a little bit more without the body. The card doesn't seem that great, but a lot of the time when you use Auchenai Soul Priest, you use it in order to combo with Circle Heal to clear the board, and if you're doing that and you're left with a 3/1 body at the end, the 3/1 body, even though it's Auchenai Soul Priest, is probably not worth the 2 extra mana you're spending. So if you're strictly designing a deck either to combo kill your opponent with heals in a very tight amount of mana crystals, or if you're only using Auchenai Soul Priest for the purposes of board clearing with Circle Healing, then Embrace the Shadow is probably for you. We haven't really seen decks that do either of those things exclusively. Generally, people run Auchenai Soul Priest because, it's just kind of a good card on its own, in addition to having these properties. So I'm not so sure it'll see play, but it has the potential. It has real potential for people to start playing like, 1-turn kill type Priest decks. It's possible with this card. Will people do it? My experience at Hearthstone is people generally try to make the most out of any burst cards they get their hands on, so people will definitely try, and I will not be surprised if people succeed. And we have Thistle Tea, rogue card, 6 mana, draw a card, and add 2 copies of it to your hand. So it's kind of like you draw 3 cards, but you don't draw them all from your deck. So if you don't want to draw cards from your deck because maybe you're playing like, Fatigue or a Mill deck or something like that, it can be better than like the Nourish effect of drawing 3 cards for 5 mana. But yes, it seems kind of bad. It seems kind of bad because usually when you draw cards, you do that to gain additional options. If you're drawing 3 of the same card, while that might be really good in some cases, in general, that will not be good enough to be spending 6 mana crystals on. So I think Thistle Tea is, on first glance, a really crappy card. And I think if they really wanted to make a card with this design, they could have just made it so, it just like basically thought steals 3 cards from your deck. It just adds 3 copies of cards from your deck. I think there's different ways to implement this type of mechanic. I feel drawing the same card 3 times is almost always going to have a bad result in a class rogue that has a lot of variance, a lot of options available from card draw in general. You kind of limit that, and it's just not so great even in that case. And we have Shadowcaster. Now, this is a pretty exciting card. It's a 5 mana 4/4, but the battle cry, choose a friendly minion, add a 1/1 copy to your hand that costs 1. So this can get really out of control. This is one of the most exciting cards. This is the type of card that I feel can enable like control rogue decks, because this card is not going to be great. It might be okay, specifically in like the Deathrattle zoo decks that we might see come up from rogue, but in general, you want to be copying very specific minions, and some of these minions can be outstanding. Now, there are some combos with Shadowcaster that are actually kind of cool. You can just copy whatever minion you want, and then if you have your second Shadowcaster and your first one didn't die from the previous turn, you can Shadowcaster your other Shadowcaster, and then you have a 1/1 for 1 Shadowcaster that you can play again and again and again and again. So if you get to that stage, you can have like an infinite number of 1/1s. So if it's like a very grindy situation where players are drawn off the top, if you do get 2 of these in the same kind of ball going, you can basically get an infinite number of 1/1s for 1 mana apiece, which is actually a really good deal, by the way. So there's that. You can also copy just some very powerful effects. You can copy like the Gadsden Auctioneer. If you're playing that spell-heavy deck, you can have a 1 mana 1/1 Gadsden to draw a lot of cards. You can maybe copy like a Malagos, but I feel if you have a Malagos and you kept it alive 1 turn, you're just going to kill your opponent. I mentioned it because some people kind of excited about that combo, but there's a lot of options. Generally, with a lot of options, you kind of need to be playing a lot of those options so you can kind of realistically get a Shadowcast effect. So what that means is you're going to have to have a rogue deck that has a lot of targets that are well suited for Shadowcaster to play Shadowcaster, and my opinion on that is you're generally going to be playing a control rogue if you do that. So should be exciting to see people try, and I think the card is potentially good enough to kind of develop that genre of a deck. And we have Twilight Summoner. 4 mana 1/1, and the Deathrattle summons a 5/5 Faceless Destroyer. Whoa. So this card is super crappy tempo. It's just so slow, and it's high risk, but it's a really good investment later on. So you're talking about like 4 mana for a total of 6/6 worth of stats. And the fact that it's on a 1/1 body, if you're playing a lot of buffs, that is actually a really good distribution. So the card is potentially incredible, but it's really slow, and it seems like it could get heavily punished if it would get out of control. It's one of those cards that, it has the potential to be pretty good, but if it ends up being pretty good, everyone's just going to play Priest, and they're going to Cabal it, they're going to Shadow Madness it. There's just so many bad things that can happen to this card. Like, game-losing level of bad. Not just bad. Not like, the minion would die easy. No. Like you play this for 4 mana, your opponent has Shadow Madness, and then you lose the game. That level of bad. So because of that, I don't think it'll really see much play, but I do think in Arena, where a lot of these cards are very rare, the cards that really punish this, you don't see too frequently, and in Arena, sometimes you can afford to drop a tempo when you play a turn 4 guy. If you're winning on turn 3 and you play this, Your opponent's not going to kill this. They're going to kill your 3-drop. The 1/1 is usually going to be enough to kill their 4-drop or their 3-drop that traded into your 3-drop. And then you have a tempo 5/5 on the following turn. So I kind of see the trades working out quite favorably in the typical, kind of relaxed minion for minion type of game that you see in Arena. So I am pretty optimistic about the card there. And we have Deathwing Dragonlord. No old god this week, but we kind of got one. It's a 10-mana dude, and it's a pretty big dude. So they redid Deathwing. It's a 12/12 still. It's still a dragon, thankfully. And then the Deathrattle puts all dragons from your hand into the battlefield. So this is really interesting. If you somehow can get multiple Deathwings in your deck, and you probably could in a few choice tavern brawls, you could have a cycling of constant Deathwings. It's probably not going to happen, but it is. There are some very exciting fringe situations where this card can really provide some amazing highlights. Now, is the card good on its own? Yeah, it's pretty good, but it's a 10-mana card, and that poses a lot of problems for typical Hearthstone games. The other issue is that it's a Deathrattle effect, so it's not an immediate effect. Deathrattle effects are typically seen as very positive in Hearthstone, but that's because they're usually attached to minions that cost between 1 and 4 mana, not 10. If you have a 10-mana card that is reliant on a Deathrattle effect, and it's actually good, then people will start playing things like Hex, and then it will be super crappy. So that's kind of how you have to look at it. This card might see some play, it might be pretty decent, but it is not going to rule the game. It is impossible for that to ever be the case, because people are going to recognize your deck before turn 10, they're going to save the hard silence removal, and then when you're going to play it, it's just not going to work. But it's still really cool, and I'm kind of glad they print cards like these, because it keeps people like me who really just love big minions and slaying and all that kind of stuff try to really make them work, even though it's quite a challenge sometimes. I do want to mention once again that just like last week, this Deathwing card, another card that works pretty well with Yoggsaron Rage Unbound. Deathwing perhaps particularly so, being a card that, not only is a 12/12 body, but has a Deathrattle effect. So if you have other big minions that happen to be dragons in your hand, it can kind of chain those, and those are the type of minions that you want to be running anyway if you're playing Yoggsaron. So there's some synergy between Yoggsaron, Deathwing, and a lot of the other cards that release this expansion. So much so that, this crazy high mana cost type of deck is probably going to materialize, probably like Warrior or something, one of the already very good control classes. But, we haven't seen play like this ever before. And it's control play. It's like a super slower combo-y control deck. And that's very exciting for me. So I very much look forward to try to making some of these decks. And overall, even though some of these cards that we've seen this week are kind of a little bit too ambitious, I am very excited to attempt to make them work. So hope you guys are as well. I hope you guys have enjoyed my thoughts and my review of this week's cards. And I'll see you guys later.